have your attention, ladies and gentlemen? I'd like to start by acknowledging my respect for the people, programs and facilities built on land surrounded by a sense of belonging, both ancient and contemporary, of the world's oldest living culture. And in doing so, I want to express my appreciation for the value of Indigenous knowledge systems as a vital part of the knowledge capital of Australia. It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for the 40th Annual Conference of the Australasian Society for Classical Studies. Professor Teresa Morgan is Professor of Greco-Roman History at Oxford University, and Nancy Bissell-Turpin Fellow and Tutor in Ancient History at Oriel College. On a personal level, it is tremendously exciting to be able to listen in person to an author whose books are in competition for having flags on the greatest number of pages of any volumes on my shelves. Professor Morgan's interests are wide and varied, and her many publications across the topics of education, morality, historiography and faith, just to name a sample, have provided rich and stimulating material to a very broad cross-section of our discipline. Tonight's topic promises to be characteristically searching and subtle in its relevance across the fields of early church history, religious architecture in Greece and Rome, and the role of interdisciplinarity itself. Professor Morgan will be speaking to us regarding God's powerhouse, piety, faith and salvation in temples and churches of the Roman Empire. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Okay, has everybody had a drink? Really important question. Good. You've all been working and thinking very hard all day. So this, I feel, is very much the cabaret slot, really. But I do want to start by saying a very warm thank you to the organising committee of this conference, because it's a huge pleasure to be here, and great congratulations to them. I can't see you because I can't see anything with my reading specs on, but great congratulations to all the committee for organising such an interesting and a very warm conference. So it's a great event to be at. Also, I should say a word about slides. We'll get to that. It doesn't have a whole lot to do with 4th century churches, but you'll get the connection in a minute. I'm really talking about ideas about buildings in this talk, rather than buildings themselves. But even so, it seemed, a shame to talk about buildings in any form and not to give you anything to look at. However, the one or two specific buildings I'm talking about don't survive. So I'm giving you one or two pictures of places where there were important churches which no longer survive, and one or two pictures of important churches which do survive from the wrong period. So they won't add a great deal of substance to the lecture, but I hope they may illustrate one or two points, and anyway they'll give you something to look at, which is always good. So this talk is a fragment, really, of one of my current research projects, which is a sequel, in effect, to my last book, and that book was called Roman Faith and Christian Faith. It came out in 2015, and it was about the meaning and operation of pistis and fides and related concepts and practices in the world of the early empire and very early Christian churches. Now, of course, pistis and fides are the terms which, in the context of early churches, we often translate belief or faith. But in regular Greek and Latin, we translate them centrally trust, trustworthiness, faithfulness, good faith, and things like that. And one of my arguments in that book was that for very early Christians, pistis and fides meant essentially very much what they meant to everybody else. So essentially, a relationship of trust and faithfulness and good faith between God and Christ and human beings. Now that, of course, is very different from what Christian faith came to mean. So one of the implications of that book, over the 400 years of early Christian evolution, they move really from thinking of pistis and fides as centrally trust and faithfulness to thinking of it as something which is kind of radically distinctive, not really like anything else in the world to which it belongs. So Augustine famously defines fides at the end of the 4th century in two ways. It's fides quae and fides qua. And fides quae is the faith that believers believe in. In other words, it's the body of doctrine. It's the group of truth claims that Christians are supposed to sign up to. whereas fides qua is a thing in the heart and mind of the believer, which sort of reaches out to a mysterious other, which is the divine. Now, it is obvious from that, but that's a pretty big evolution from trust and faithfulness. And incidentally, it's also interesting, the sort of relationality of trust and faithfulness has really fallen out of Augustine's account of fides. And in order to, go on having a natural relationship with God and humanity, he puts love in the place of, really in the place that trust held for very early Christians. So anyway, that evolution raises the question in my mind, what on earth happened in those 400 years to make that remarkable change in the way that Christians thought about faith? And how did it happen? And that's what this book is about. And a fragment, not that you're not getting the whole book, you'll be glad to know. So you're getting a fragment of that. So I'll be looking at sort of the development of ideas around belief and orthodoxy, ideas about both the public and the interior landscape of faith, liturgy and prayer and things like that, what it means to live a faithful life in a community, the expression of faith in art, and the relationship between faith and space and place, which I'm going to talk about now. For those of you who are more interested in Greek and Roman spaces and places than Christian ones, I am going to get to some of those, I promise. But I'm going to start with the relationship between faith and space and place in Christian thinking, which is interesting, not least because for about the first 300 years of Christian development, there was no relationship to speak of. Now, a note of caution is in order here, of course, because trying to explain a negative is always methodologically risky. Too often the identification of a puzzling absence is based on the assumption that some positive phenomenon attested elsewhere must be the norm, which it may just not be, But in this case, there is some justification for it, because Christians use faith language so extensively and so systematically that its absence from early writing about space and place is striking. And I'm going to talk here in rather general terms about kind of Christians as a group, because in the first 3 centuries we don't have enough evidence to detect differences between the ways that individuals or churches thought about faith and buildings. And in the 4th century, the discourses actually seem to be quite widely shared. So I will talk just about Christians tout court. So from our earliest sources, pistis or fides language is linked discursively with almost all the other key concepts and practices of the new cult, but almost never with the physical context of worship. And as far as I know, never in unequivocally positive terms. So, for instance, Paul connects pistis with place only to say to the people of Corinth in 1 Corinthians 3:10, "Don't you know that you, hoi pistoi, are the temple of God? The Spirit of God lives in you." Clement of Alexandria extends that idea in his Protrepticus in the 2nd century to say, "Christ builds his temple in people, so that he may set up the shrine of God in humanity." And he connects that idea first with a natural theology, a Greek natural theology, that says that the divine is everywhere in the universe, and secondly with his virtue ethics, according to which we imitate God by regulating our souls in our bodies to be as godlike as possible. Meanwhile, the author of the 2nd century Psalms of Solomon in Psalm 4 adapts the Hebrew Psalm 84:19, "One day in your courts in the temple is better than 1,000 elsewhere," to say, "1 hour in your faith is more excellent than all days and years." So not only do early Christians not connect faith with particular places, but they make a bit of a virtue of saying that faith is independent of place. And I don't think we really need to be surprised by that. A lot of early worship must have taken place in informal contexts, or very ad hoc. When Christians did begin to create their own places of worship, they intermittently risked attack from hostile neighbours or a nervous Roman administration, so there probably wasn't much incentive to invest much in those spaces, either materially or theologically. And in the cause of making a virtue of that non-connection, Christians also link the idea that your relationship with God and Christ matters more than where you practice it, with another early topos, which is that prayer and praise should be a full-time occupation. Very demanding business being an early Christian. It's improved a lot since then, I'm glad to say. As Paul says to the Thessalonians, rejoice always, pray without ceasing. By the 2nd century, this has turned into an invitation to pray regularly, wherever you are, at home, in the fields, on board a ship. The 2nd century apostolic tradition instructs the faithful to pray every 3 hours without fail, from cockcrow, wherever they are, and about midnight, get up again, wash your hands with water, and once more set about your prayer. And if your wife is there, of course, you should pray together. If your wife is not a Christian, presumably she gets to sleep through the night. Quite a strong incentive, I should have thought, not to convert, really. So the idea that Christians individually or collectively are a temple, so it doesn't matter if after 70 they don't have a temple or any very elaborate architecture, dovetails with other early ideas about worship and seems to be widely shared. Now, things may be beginning to change by the later 3rd century, by when we know that there were quite a lot of dedicated church buildings around the empire. So Book 2 of the Apostolic Constitutions, if it's as early as the late 3rd century, talks about the church building as having a symbolic meaning. It's a ship, or it's a sheepfold. And it urges people rather optimistically to go to church every day, morning and night. Like the non-Christians go to their temples and synagogues every day. Also rather optimistic, I'm guessing, you know. But it still, that work still doesn't connect the building with faith language. For that, we have to wait till the 4th century, when Constantine's Edict of Toleration of 313 changes the landscape. And one of our earliest witnesses to that is also one of the most dramatic. Now, at this point, I'm going to talk in a minute about the cathedral at Tyre. The cathedral at Tyre is one of those which has probably vanished without trace. There's no absolute agreement even about where it was. So I thought no point really in giving you a picture of modern Tyre or even of the excavations, which are probably nothing to do with the church. Therefore, I have given you this very nice picture, a very distinguished bas-relief of a Phoenician-built warship. That's rather a long time before the period we're talking about, but it's a properly interesting piece of art. And as I've just said, the very earliest image, literary image for a temple is as a ship. That is my excuse. That's not the cathedral at Tyre either. That's Santa Pudenziana in Rome. That is one of the earliest churches to survive in anything like its original form. Probably doesn't look anything like the cathedral at Tyre looked. It's rather low-key, actually, if anything. But anyway, it's at least a 4th century church, making an effort. Anyway, in 315, very soon after Constantine's edict, Bishop Paulinus of Tyre completed a grand new cathedral which he had deliberately and symbolically built on the site of a previous church which had been destroyed by non-Christians. And he invited Bishop Eusebius from nearby Caesarea to give an oration at the consecration. And Eusebius preserves a version of this speech in his ecclesiastical history, 10:4. This is. Eusebius calls the cathedral, in the tradition of the Jerusalem temple and indeed Greek and Roman temples, God's house on earth. And he says, it is no longer by hearing the spoken word that people learn about the power of God. We can now see, he says, with our own eyes, that the traditions of the past were trustworthy and true, pistaka elether. This church of the living God is a pillar and foundation of truth, and by it God has proved trustworthy the record of the ancient narratives foretelling the humbling of the mighty and the exalting of the humble. And he has done this not only for the faithful, hoi pistoi, but also for non-Christians, hoi apistoi. For Eusebius, and it turns out for Paulinus, the cathedral building in its glory expresses God's power, and like a human preacher or a text, it teaches viewers about God. It confirms the faith of the faithful, as Eusebius spells out with a great list of examples and scriptural quotations, and it creates faith, or the conditions for faith, in unbelievers. So a gateway to the outer enclosure of the church gives a clear view into the precincts from the street. And this, Eusebius says, has the effect of turning the faces, even of outsiders to the faith, to the entrances, so that no one can hurry past without having his soul mightily struck by the miracle. And by this means, Eusebius explains, Paulinus hopes to impel non-Christians to have their steps turned to the entrance of the church and the entrance to the faith. In this passage, the church is given a new and a very specific set of duties, which between them encompass a lot of the work of bringing people to faith and strengthening the faith of the faithful, which historically has been performed by human preaching, teaching, example, miracles, scripture, and tradition. Now, the idea that a building can confirm God's faithfulness to his people has a precedent in the building and dedication of Solomon's temple in 1 Kings. But Eusebius' account of what the Tyrian cathedral does is very different and much more elaborate than anything in 1 Kings. For anyone who shares my interest, by the way, in what kind of pistis is at stake in this context, I think the faith that is being created and strengthened is very much fides qua. It is the content of Christian preaching, which Eusebius thinks has been vindicated by the accession of Constantine. Eusebius then describes the cathedral, emphasizing its superhuman beauty, the wisdom of its design, the embossed bronze and iron gates, the towering walls, the porches and colonnades, the inlaid marble floor. It's clear that both believers and non-believers are expected to be struck by the wonder of it all. And wonder in Christian texts is also a traditional precursor to pistis, or the increase of pistis. But the idea that faith might be inflamed by the beauty of a building is new. Towards the end of the oration, Eusebius turns to the scriptural idea that the faithful are given to Christ by God to be built up into a building themselves. And he describes the church as a kind of physical expression of the people. And he says that the whole edifice is supported by pistis. So some people are entrusted, literally, with acting as entrances to the house of God. Others are props under the first quadrangle. Others form the basilica and so on. And catechumens can enter the building, but only the faithful, who are always the baptized, toi pistoi, enjoy a divine vision of what is innermost. And this image sort of plays on the commonplace identification of the faithful with the church, in the sense of the community, and the church with the faith. But it also relies on a vision of how people interact with the physical building. You know, the more deeply one is involved, the further one progresses into the building, into the church, and the more one's faith is nourished by divine visions. Well, Eusebius gives a vivid impression of the joy and triumphalism of Christians who for the first time are enjoying imperial toleration and then patronage, and who can suddenly dare to build large, prominent, highly decorative churches and develop elaborate, publicly visible rituals in them. Elaborate churches like that, also Santa Pudenziana. And his vision of churches as active promoters of faith is soon common currency. At the other end of the century, another Paulinus writes in a poem about the church complex that he has built at Nola in South Italy. And he says, "How, therefore, will this building provide a model former by which I can cultivate myself, build myself up and renew my faculties, and establish myself as a dwelling place for Christ?" Now, developing your faith through imitatio Christi is a familiar idea, you know, just as a Greek or a Roman might develop any virtue by imitating the example of a good or a famous person. But here we have imitatio Idis, imitation of a building, as a spiritual technique. And that is new. The idea that churches can act as miracles or portents to foster faith is also picked up by a lot of other writers, and it appears in several colourful stories by the church historians Solomon and Socrates, for instance. In one city, a story is told of a baptistry, which prevents a man who has already been baptized and is trying to get rebaptized to get his sins wiped out again. It stops him doing it by miraculously emptying itself every time he gets in. I think there was a leak, they didn't seem to check. Miraculous leak. There's also a story about the future Emperor Julian and his brother Gallus as boys. They're living in Cappadocia and they decide to raise a shrine. This is the time when Julian is growing up Christian. They're going to raise a shrine over the tomb of a local saint called Mammon. But Julian's section keeps collapsing, which is allegedly interpreted, even at the time, as a sign of his lack of true pistis. There we are. There's another church that I'm not going to talk about, but one that survives wonderfully, the very numinous Santa Maria Maggiore from the 5th century. It's looking very good there, actually. When you go nowadays, it tends to be full of collapsing chairs, which makes it look a lot less numinous, really. I think the effect of plastic chairs on spirituality, not really been fully appreciated, I think. Anyway, Eusebius refers to the cathedral at Tyre as God's house. And that phrase introduces another development in the discourse connecting faith with church buildings. Because through the 4th century, churches are increasingly understood as the principal places where the faithful encounter God and Christ, and going to church as the principal way that the faithful practice their faith. And that is a very big shift from the 1st or the 2nd century, where you can and should practice your faith and encounter God everywhere. So John Chrysostom calls the church, in a sermon on 1 Corinthians, a place of angels, a place of archangels, a palace of God. And church buildings are increasingly described, and often in passing as if it's completely uncontroversial, as the places for prayer and repentance and the strengthening of your faith. In Augustine's Confessions, a church building plays a key role in a high-profile conversion. And this is the story of the grammarian Victorinus, who is interested in Christianity and is studying Scripture. But his and Augustine's friend Simplicianus tells him that he won't believe that Victorinus is really a Christian until he has seen him in church. And Victorinus says, jokingly, but it is a very sound theological point, is it walls then that make a Christian? To which Simplicianus does not have an answer. But one day, Victorinus says to Simplicianus, let us go to church. I want to become a Christian. Simplicianus is overjoyed. In church, says Augustine, Victorinus, real instruction begins, and eventually he makes his profession in front of the populace of the Fidi of Rome. Now, Augustine also talks in the Enchiridion about the church as the place where instruction takes place. And so what is at issue between Victorinus and Simplicianus here, I think, is partly the importance of official instruction in the church and participation in a community as part of what it is to be a Christian, as opposed to sort of private study. But it is significant in itself that the instruction takes place in the church building. For Simplicianus, and perhaps for Augustine, it is actually, to some significant degree, the walls that make the fidus. However, not everybody is happy with these developments. In 395, for instance, the new importance of church buildings is attacked by Jerome in a characteristically irritable letter to Paulinus of Nola. This is letter 58. Jerome deplores the new assumption that Christians need buildings to meet God in, as he claims the Jews needed the temple. You are the temple of the Lord, he says, quoting Paul. The Holy Spirit lives in you. One aim of this letter is actually to persuade Paulinus that he doesn't need to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, because if the faithful can encounter God anywhere, then there is no advantage in travel. For a man who was extremely well-travelled, Augustine was very against the travel industry. And Jerome was very against it. I think Augustine was quite favourable. Anyway, worse still, according to Jerome, some people think that if churches are places of divine encounter, then they should be decorated as lavishly as possible. Like that. Still, Santa Maria Maggiore. Now, Jerome thinks that there are better uses than this for wealth. He says the true temple of Christ is the soul of the faithful person. Decorate that, clothe that, make gifts to it, welcome Christ in it. What good are walls shining with jewels when Christ in his poor is in danger of starving to death? So Jerome's reservation about church buildings are linked both to his concern for the community and to his interest in the interiority of faith, the individual soul as the place where the worshipper meets God. And he's not alone in that. But we can infer from his objections that for many worshippers, faith increasingly involves new forms of exteriority. Building, decorating churches, making expensive gifts to them are becoming germane to the divine-human relationship. By the mid-5th century, it's commonplace to refer to churches as the places where the faithful encounter God and Christ, where you do your religion. Peter Chrysologus, for instance, who was Bishop of Ravenna in the mid-5th century, in his sermons, takes for granted that making an act of faith means going to church. So in Sermon 6 on Psalm 99, he says that Scripture tells us to go into God's gates with praise. And he says, as we enter the gate of the church, we make a confession of faith, we sing hymns in its atria, and then we utter full praises in the inner sanctuary where the whole fullness of the Godhead resides. Back in the mid-4th century, Bishop Cyril of Jerusalem also mentions that idea that Eusebius has of progression through the church building as an image for progression in faith. And he adds a little more to Eusebius's idea. In the introduction to his catechetical lectures, this is Pro Catechesis 2, as delivered to the catechumens during Lent 347-8 in the Constantinian church complex in Jerusalem before the catechumens were baptized on Easter Sunday. Cyril, in this preliminary oration, Cyril warns the catechumens that they should not approach baptism saying, now we're finally going to find out what the faithful do at the Eucharist. He says, do you expect, he says, to see and not to be seen? God will be investigating you. A church is not a place where you go to satisfy your curiosity. It is not a place where you are in control. It's a place of mystery, divine encounter, risk, and change. The church here has become a unique environment, both safe because God is there and radically unsafe because baptism is only the beginning of your encounter with God. So it not only shares the role of miracles and preaching and scripture in spreading the gospel like Eusebius's cathedral does, but it has a role which is all its own. And Cyril also makes a lot of the choreography of baptism. He talks about how baptisms enter the baptistry, and then facing west towards the realm of darkness, they stretch out a hand and renounce Satan. Then they turn east towards the body of the church and the altar to symbolize turning towards light and paradise. And they affirm their pistis in God and Christ and the Holy Spirit. Then after baptism, they enter the church for the first time as pistoi. So again, the spatial organization of the church reflects the progress of the faithful from baptism to faithful life to the celebration of the Eucharist. So, by the late 4th century, the activity of churches has become a rich and complex discursive field. Church buildings can behave like portents and miracles, or like preachers and texts to teach both outsiders and insiders about the gospel and confirm its truth. And churches also create a space in which worshippers encounter God and Christ and are changed by that encounter. And the movement of inquirers and catechumens and community members through church space is beginning to reflect their journey in the faith itself. And on one level, all those activities are an evolution within Christian thinking. But evolution, of course, can also be revolutionary. And the 4th century marks a real shift away from the idea of divine human pistis as a relationship practiced anywhere and everywhere, towards the idea of faith as practiced above all through shared rituals in God's house. The church building has become a definitive symbol and locus for Christianity for the first time. But I know, being the audience that you are, you did not miss my passing mention of ritual just then. I saw several people perk up, thinking, now we're going to get to the temples. Excellent. Yes, quite right, we are now going to get to the temples. You know. Because, of course, the concept of ritual for any of us raises an obvious question. You know, are any of these developments purely internal to Christianity, or do they actually also have roots in the wider Greek and Roman world? And if so, do those roots tell us any more about the significance of the way that Christians are linking faith with churches? That is a leading question. The answer is going to be yes. Yeah. So, the idea that a church is God's house has got very obvious precedents throughout the ancient world. The idea that a building might teach or change potential or actual worshippers is largely unexplored in the wider world. Now, we needn't expect Greek or Roman or Jewish buildings specifically to be fostering pistis or fides, certainly. But the possibility that they act on worshippers in some way, I think, deserves some exploration. And a point in passing about methodology here, because in classics there is now a large literature which speculates basically about what the impact of buildings and spaces and urban assemblages and so on might have been on their ancient viewers. And that is a very sophisticated and stimulating body of scholarship, but it does tend to sort of weave anything that the sources have to say into a process of imaginative reconstruction, without distinguishing very clearly between the ancient and the modern discourse. But there is something to be gained, I think, about from being clear, what our sources actually talk about and what they don't. So for instance, when it comes to temples, there is a mass of ancient writing about the impact that temple statues have on worshippers, but there is very little about the impact of buildings, which is very odd. I mean, these are very big, visible, expensive, elaborate, prominent buildings, but there is very little about the effect that they have on worshippers as worshippers. Now, I suspect that that is rather interesting in its own right, and it is also interesting for thinking about early Christianity. Anyway, one natural place to look for precedents to Christian thinking is going to be in the Jewish scriptures, of course. But again, there is oddly little in the Jewish scriptures that seems to parallel the kind of discourse I've been talking about. So for instance, in the Psalms, the prophetic writings, God is often closely identified with his temple, and he is said to act from the temple or the Temple Mount, but no passage that I can think of describes the building itself as a power for creating or strengthening, say, piety or righteousness. As close as anything, perhaps, is Psalm 43:3, "Send forth your light and your truth. They shall lead me on and bring me to your holy mountain, to your dwelling place." But it is God's light and truth that act there, not those of the building. Ezekiel 43 emphasizes the glory of the temple, but not its active power on worshippers. Actually, the nearest Jewish precedent for 4th century Christian ideas may be Josephus' Antiquities in Book 8. This is the passage where he talks about how King Jeroboam reacted to the building of Solomon's temple. He was very worried that if his own people went down to Jerusalem and saw this temple, they would be so impressed that they would defect and become Solomon's subjects. So he built his own temple at Bethel in competition, to try to keep them on side. Which does suggest that Josephus thought, at least, that buildings could have some kind of effect on piety at some level, possibly not a very profound religious level, but on some level. On the Greek and Roman side, there's a very interesting 1989 article by the art historian Christine Smith on Eusebius' oration at Tyre, in which she traces the precedents in Greek and Latin literature for praise of buildings and cities. And in the process, though it's not actually her main point in the article, but in the process she does show that, from Isocrates to Libanius, nothing in Greek and Latin panegyric actually parallels Eusebius' idea that buildings have an intrinsic power, their own power, to attract worshippers or alter their response to the gods. Casting the net a bit more widely beyond orations in Greek and Latin literature does produce a handful, I think, of partial parallels. This is where it gets a bit more interesting. Not a lot, but a little bit. Now, temple buildings, of course, routinely express the power or the mood of the god. Their doors burst open when the god is angry, or worst case scenario, leaving the city. Buildings, they quake, they spontaneously catch fire, they grow monstrous spiders' webs. But those are all places where the buildings are expressing the emotion of the god, really. They're not acting in their own right. In On Superstition, Plutarch does say that you can claim asylum in a temple not only by touching the cult statue, but also actually just by touching the walls of the building, as if the building can also represent the god. But again, the building is not acting in its own right. Later in On Superstition, this is one of my favourite passages, Plutarch describes how the superstitious man approaches the temples of the gods, as fearfully as he would the dens of bears or snakes or the lairs of sea monsters. And he expresses his fear by overwashing or underwashing, extreme prostration. I don't think we do enough of that these days, extreme prostration. I think it's good. Obsessive praying, panic, even madness at the sound of ritual drumming. But Plutarch doesn't actually suggest that it is the buildings themselves that are producing this reaction. It's the gods which he is expecting to encounter in the buildings. Having said that, Strabo's geography does seem to give a little more agency to buildings in his description in Book 5 of the Campus Martius in Rome, because he says that one area is so thick with temples that they seem, he says, to be proclaiming, and his verb is apophainein, they seem to be proclaiming that the rest of the city is just incidental to their holiness. And he says some rich and famous Romans have responded to this by erecting their family tombs in that area. So the temple's declaration that this is a holy place has apparently affected the behaviour of worshippers there. And Vitruvius, in De Architectura Book 4, also seems to recognise this possibility, with just a hint that architects can design places of worship to elicit a response from worshippers. He says, "Let altars face east, and always be placed lower than the images which will be in the temple, so that those who pray and sacrifice may look up to their divinity from various levels, as is appropriate to each god. And the heights of the altars should be arranged so that those to the Jupiter and the gods of heaven are as exalted as possible, and those to Vesta and earth and sea are placed much lower." Now, he doesn't describe the response that he aims to provoke by this, but he does, I think, imply that altars and temple buildings play a role in reflecting and maybe even enhancing the experience of those who use them in some way. I also toyed in this context with one or two of those sort of disparaging references to imperial cult that crop up in early imperial literature. Arrian in Anabasis 4 and Dio Cassius in Book 52, they make, respectively, Callisthenes argue to Alexander and Agrippa argue to Augustus that they shouldn't be building temples to themselves, because temples raised to human beings cannot make them divine. And temple buildings should not be used to try to influence potential worshippers. Interesting, Agrippa makes that argument explicitly in Dio Cassius. Now that might suggest that temple buildings in themselves have some power to affect worshippers, which is quite interesting. But it is very slender stuff compared with the Christian material. I also wondered at one point whether the idea of sort of Newman or Genius Loci or Daimon Topu would be a promising avenue, describing the religious feeling that moves worshippers unexpectedly in certain locations. And so, of course, Seneca, for instance, famously describes to Lucilius in letter 41 how when a person suddenly comes across a grove of ancient trees in a forest or a natural cave under a mountain, he says, your soul will be shaken by a certain sense of reverence, which indicates the presence of the divine. Well, if a sense of reverence is normal and appropriate in the presence of the divine, then no doubt Seneca expects people to feel it in temples as well. But it is not clear, I think, that it's the place rather than the presence of God that is having the impact on worshippers. The fact that you can feel the presence of the God in a natural environment actually rather suggests that the presence of human structures is not decisive. So, in fact, in other words, it's not in the idea of genius loci. It's not the genius loci that is so important as the genius loci, as it were, it's the God. Also, it has to be said, recent scholarship seems to downplay the significance of Newman loci in Roman religiosity, and nobody's ever really thought it was all that important in Greek religiosity, so I think it's probably not a very likely precedent for Christian thinking. So that doesn't help us very much either. However, there are two Greek cults which might offer something a bit more interesting. The Eleusinian mysteries have what has been reconstructed, at least, as an elaborate and carefully choreographed initiation ritual. As initiands enter the sanctuary, supposedly they are given a wreath and then led in procession to the great hall, the telesterion, and there the main rituals are conducted by priests, the senior of whom occupies a throne near the entrance to the anacteron, the most sacred part of the building. And then as neophytes leave the telesterion, they're given new clothes as a symbol of their new status. And all that progress through the building, among other things, rather heavily prefigures Christian accounts of baptism. But historians have tended to assume that what changes the status of initiands is less the space they move through than the accompanying liturgy. But a passing comment by Plutarch might just suggest otherwise. In how a man may become aware of his progress in virtue, Plutarch uses the mysteries as an image for initiation into philosophy. And he says, just as those who are being initiated crowd together at the beginning with noise and shouting, and they shove each other, but when the rites are being performed and revealed, they immediately attend in awe and silence, these are the initiands of the mysteries. So too, at the beginning of the practice of philosophy, around its doors, you will see a lot of noise and babble and boasting, and some people vulgarly try to shove their way to a reputation by force. I'm sure the graduate students in the audience will recognize that picture. Early academic life, still good 2,000 years later. But he says, the man who has got inside and seen a great light, as though a shrine had been opened, he adopts a different attitude of silence and amazement. And humbly and in good order, he attends on reason as on a god. So at first here, it seems to be the rites that change the attitude of the initiand. But in the second half of the building, of the image, the building itself seems to change people as they step inside it. And an even more vivid pre-echo of Christian thinking is inspired by the cult of Asclepius in the 2nd century. Because Aelius Aristides, Oration 39, is in praise of the well in the Pergamene temple of Asclepius. And he says, we should ornament this well with speech and address the Saviour God whose work and creation it is. Because the well is in the most beautiful place on earth, in the most beautiful part of the sanctuary, and it flows from the very foundations of where the temple stands, so that this opinion and belief, this doxa and pistis, forces itself on everyone, that the water flows from a place that is healthy and gives health. And Aristides goes on to describe the well, not just as expressing the God's power, but as the God's co-worker, and as a miracle worker in its own right. He says, the God uses it like any synergos, like any co-worker, And the well has often helped many people to obtain what they wanted from the god. Just like the sons of doctors and wonder workers are trained to help their fathers, the well helps the god in everything. And for many men, it's like a drug. Now, we have no idea whether Eusebius knew that speech. But there, surely, is a cultural ancestor of his preaching cathedral. And here, too, I think, the patterns in explicit Greek and Roman discourse add something to our understanding of Greek and Roman and Christian religiosity alike. Because on some level, common sense suggests that all Greek and Roman temples and sacred boundaries and altars and groves and all those things, they probably had some effect on worshippers, framing, guiding their experience as well as their ritual actions. But these effects are very, very rarely marked. Any effects are explicitly marked almost entirely in connection with Asclepius and the mysteries, and admittedly only rarely there. But the mysteries and Asclepius have in common that by healing or blessing worshippers or paving their way to a happy afterlife, they significantly change some aspect of their adherents' current state or future expectations. So cults which are particularly interested in the power of buildings are the ones whose worshippers are most marked as being changed by them. The houses of the gods have a distinctive status when entering them, sleeping in them, or being initiated in them somehow changes the worshipper's life. And Asclepius and the mysteries share another well-known quality. Both are especially detested by Christians. Christians seem to have seen them both as key competitors for all the reasons that I've just mentioned. And that, I think, suggests another reason why 4th century Christians began to discuss the active power of church buildings. It may have been a rhetorical move to position churches as more powerful and more attractive and more transformative than two of the most popular competing cults. If so, then the competition may not all have run one way. Because in the 380s, the great orator and notable apistos, Libanius of Antioch, delivered an oration, this is oration 30, to the Christian emperor Theodosius, protesting at what he claims is the widespread desecration of temple buildings by monks. And in this speech, he speaks movingly about what temples mean to people, especially in the countryside. He says, they are the soul of the countryside. In them, the farming communities rest their hopes for husbands, wives, children, for their oxen and the soil they sow and plant. When a countryside loses its temples, the country is blinded and declines and dies. Now, Libanius emphasizes that it is not that people are using the temples to make sacrifices which would have been illegal. It is the buildings themselves, he says, which are like ships in which the weary find rest. And when they're destroyed, their communities are like shipwrecked sailors, swept from the ships in which they sailed. And he also mentions that statues are being destroyed, but it is the temple buildings that he focuses on, and that is highly unusual. But Libanius was a dab hand at adapting Christian ideas for his own purposes, and I suspect that's what's going on here. And by the way, I'm sure there are a few more vulgar reasons too why Christians talk increasingly about the power of buildings. Once churches are built, then bishops and presbyters, are going to want them to look good and preferably better than the next door temple. So it's a strong incentive to encourage decoration and investment. Well, It isn't only church buildings that are becoming a focus of faith from the 4th century. Very similar discourses develop around pilgrimage sites, which themselves are often acquiring large churches, of course, at that time. And there is not time to talk about pilgrimage today, but I will just mention, that the 4th century sees the burgeoning of the idea that going on pilgrimage is both an expression of faith and a way of developing your faith. And the idea that pilgrimage expresses and develops your faith also attracts criticism, from the same people who don't like the idea that churches can grow your faith. So Gregory of Nyssa, for instance, says loftily in letter 2 to somebody called Kensitor, that he did, in fact, happen to go to Jerusalem once for business, but it didn't make any difference to his faith. And Jerome says, access to the courts of heaven is as easy from Britain as it is from Jerusalem. Britain being the furthest and least spiritual place he can think of course. But pilgrimage, as I say, is really a topic in its own right. However, speaking of Britain, I would like to offer you a little piece before I finish of reception history for those of you who are interested in reception. If you'd like to cast your minds forward about 1400 years after Jerome, to 1836, and to my own hometown of Oxford, and as it happens to my own home parish of Littlemore on the outskirts of Oxford. Because in the 1830s, the great churchman, later cardinal, now incipient saint, John Henry Newman, was the vicar of Oxford's University Church of St Mary in the centre of the city. And he discovered that part of his parish was the small and impoverished village of Littlemore on the edge of the city. Now, nobody from Littlemore went to church at St Mary's because it's 4 miles away up a steep hill, But Newman thought that they should at least have a chapel of their own. And he set about to build them one, in fact, what became not a chapel but a church. But being John Henry Newman, he didn't just want to build a church. He wanted to build a new idea of a church. So a few weeks after the consecration, he preached a sermon in which he compares the church to a text. He says, "What I shall say will, as it were, turn this church into a book, a holy book, in which you may look and read, and which will suggest to you many good thoughts of God and heaven." As people approached the church, he said, they would approach its only door, which symbolized Christ, the only door to salvation. They would pass the baptismal font and see the cross over the altar, symbolizing the incarnation, the triple east window symbolizing the Trinity, and the arches beneath it symbolizing Psalm 119, 7 times a day do I praise you. Now, in 1836, the idea of a church as a text or a teacher was deemed radically new. And it was picked up by adherents of the Oxford movement and others, and it became very influential in 19th century church architecture. I think Newman must have got it from the 4th century, because he is, of course, famous for his interest in the church fathers and in applying their ideas to the church of his own day. Anyway, to conclude, in the modern Western world, religious buildings across many traditions, and places with religious associations are widely seen as attractive, numinous, potentially transformative, by their location, their architectural beauty or their associations. They speak both to the curious and to the reverent. Once inside, visitors often expect to find them, slightly mysterious, to have that numinous atmosphere, to be rather powerful. Some don't expect to remain fully in control of their experience. Some people hope to encounter the divine and in some way to be inspired or changed. That whole cluster of discourses is substantially the creation of 4th century churches. The idea that church buildings can create, alter, increase pistis and fides springs into being and spreads with remarkable speed in the years after 313. And it helps to make churches and other significant places like pilgrimage sites central to the thinking of many, if not all, worshippers. Doing your religion for Christians stops being a matter of, doing your relationship with God whenever and wherever, 24 hours a day. It becomes about going to church on a Sunday. Anyway, one such experience of going to church perhaps provides a good ending. It is long literary hymn for the lighting of the lamps. The late 4th century poet Prudentius describes being in church during a night liturgy. So the hymn begins in lines 1 to 4 by asking Christ to restore light to his fideles at dawn. And at its climax, it describes how we pass the long night with pious joy in festival gatherings. Sleepless in prayer, we earnestly heap up petitions that will be granted, and on the high altar make offerings to God. This is an adapted version of the Lobe, by the way. The lamps gleam out, hanging by swaying cords from every panel of the roof, and the flame, fed by the oil on which it lazily floats, casts its light through the clear glass, until you would think that the starry sky itself stood over us. The faithful are inspired to new thoughts of God. The church expresses their gratitude for creation. It acts as an image for creation. And it embodies God's assurance, his fides, that light will come again. For Prudentius, the church building makes material the very assurance of salvation. Thank you.
In thanking Professor Morgan for such a wonderful keynote address, there are just 3 things I'd like to briefly mention that really struck me from this paper. The first of which is the idea of community. So just as you are as close to heaven from Britain as you are from Jerusalem, I think this is a wonderful demonstration of the fact that although Professor Morgan has come from 17,000 kilometres away, we as a discipline share a passion that connects us from Oxford to Armidale, that it creates a community of scholarship and of minds that is an incredibly rich and valuable resource, which is a beautiful thing to see. The second thing that really strikes me is the contemporary relevance of so much of this debate. I don't know if you've ever heard of a very contentious Australian priest called Father Bob Maguire.
Oh, no.
He shares many ideas with Jerome about the spending of wealth on buildings. And I can remember at my nephew's christening in Melbourne when he said, if you're looking for a miracle, if you're looking for the house of God, it's not in here. It was this morning when you walked past a single mother taking care of her 4 children and making sure that they were fed and making sure that they safely crossed the road. That's a miracle. And so these are very much ideas that we're still speaking to today and debating today. And the last thing that really strikes me is the power of communication, because I think you will all agree with me that the kind of passionate eloquence that we saw in Professor Morgan's speech is the kind of thing that guarantees that our discipline will continue as it communicates with the widest possible audience. So thank you so much for your talk tonight.
Thank you. There was a question about whether we were going to have 10 minutes of questions or whether we were just going to go and eat barbecue.
I will refer to Bronwyn as my master in all things. There is time for questions.
I mean, entirely up to you.